Hey everyone, this is Mr. Miller here, and we are going to be talking today about Monster from Walter Dean Myers, which is our story in our new unit. Before I begin, just wanted to say that if you are missing or absent, this is the first video for like the entire unit. That if you are missing, you need to go to Google Classroom and look at the Monster GRP. It's GRP is for guided reading practice. If you missed out on any notes that are not discussed in this video, this entire booklet will be put on Google Classroom as well as other parts. So please do keep that in mind if you are missing or something of that nature. You need to go check that out too as we go through this, because I'm not going to go through every single thing because I'm going to have other lessons dedicated to this packet here. So keep that in mind. So anyway, I do not have any learning targets here right now, but that's perfectly fine. I will have them up later as I go. But before I talk about anything, I want to talk about Walter Dean Myers. So Walter Dean Myers, he's a picture of him. That is the name and, of course, the person who wrote the story Monster, which we will be reading. He was born on August 12th, 1937 in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and he died July 1st, 2014 in New York City. So Myers was given up to another family when he was 3 years old and taken from his West Virginia to Harlem in New York City, which is very, very sad. He, grew up without really knowing his parents. And the reason why is that when he was born in 1937, West Virginia was a very racist place, and African Americans could not do very well. So the parents knew that he would have a better life moving to the north, and they couldn't afford to go north, so they had him go north. So it's still really sad. As a child, Myers did not do well in school. He did not get good grades. He also had a temper and fought a lot. The reason why he had a temper is because he had a lisp, and he had a hard time, pronouncing words, and people made fun of him. So he got into a lot of fights. At one point, I think it was a high school teacher, it was a teacher of some kind, that told him instead of fighting, he should use his words to write down his emotions, um, to kind of get him to stay out of violence. And that actually is what started Walter Dean Myers down his path to writing. Unfortunately, though, for Myers, he dropped out at 17. He joined the military, and after that, he became a writer once he got out of the military. He did go back to high school and get his high school diploma at some point. And if I remember correctly, it's actually a high school in Chicago, which is pretty cool. So, as a writer, he has written around 100 books, and he has won many awards for his books and is considered to be one of the best African American writers in history, especially for books that are written for like teens and young adults. Most of his books are about teens and young adults, primarily African American teens and young adults, and most of them take place in New York City, just like our story is going to be taking place. And actually, the background of this story is that Walter Dean Myers actually was taking notes at a trial and for a book that he was going to be writing, and then across the street, school was getting out, and he could hear the kids getting out of school. And then he decided he's going to mash the two things together. So I don't really want to spoil the plot for you, but that's kind of the reason why he has this story. All right. So anyway, setting of Monster. The story takes place in Harlem, which is a part of Manhattan, which is a part of New York City. I know that sounds kind of confusing, but I will explain that in a second. So there are three important places within this story. They are the courtroom, jail, and the Harlem neighborhood where the protagonist Steve Harmon lives and grows up. So keep that in mind. And the setting of the story takes place in the state of New York, and more specifically New York City. So New York is right here, and New York City is right here. It's like at the very southern tip of New York, and it's kind of like an island. So to make sense of this, New York City is divided into three. Like the story of Monster gets can be subdivided. What I mean subdivided is that, like for example, um, Kenosha is a city within Kenosha County, and Kenosha County is within the state of Wisconsin. The same thing kind of applies to New York City. So New York City is located in the state of New York, like I said, is the largest city in America, and there are approximately 8.82 million people living in the city. It is huge. Um, However, just like in Kenosha County, there's more cities in Kenosha County than just Kenosha. There's like Wilmot and Twin Lakes, and the same thing can be said about the same thing can be said. Oops, the same thing can be said about New York City. New York City is divided into these like medium or small sized neighborhoods called boroughs. And in the city, the boroughs are Staten Island, Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, and the Bronx. Okay. And our story takes place in this area of New York City in the borough of Manhattan. Okay. So there's not a lot of other talk about these other boroughs because most of it takes place in Manhattan. So it just takes place in a specific part of the city. So Manhattan is the borough where the events of the story take place in. Manhattan is the most densely populated borough in the city of New York. Manhattan has many big companies and world famous companies called this part of, I should say, part of the city. I forgot to put that in there. Part of the city. Oh, the Empire State Building, Times New Squares, and Broadway are found in Manhattan. So, like a lot of the things you see in movies and in television are all found here in this part of the city. So, and Manhattan can be subdivided too because there's neighborhoods within Manhattan, and our story takes place in the neighborhood of Harlem. So, Harlem is a neighborhood within Manhattan. And in the 1920s, so about 100 years ago, many African Americans from all over the country, particularly in the South, came to Harlem to better their lives. A lot of African Americans from the South were treated badly because of segregation and racism, so they moved to New York to better their lives. This time period in the 1920s was called the Harlem Renaissance. A lot of important African Americans who were standing up for their rights, as well as making music and being artists and working in the fields of science and business, all came to the city and lived within this neighborhood. So a lot of famous people came out of Harlem in the 1920s, and the same thing goes for today. Some of the famous people that come out of Harlem, just a small amount from modern day times would be ASAP Rocky, Puff Daddy, Tupac Shakur, and Malcolm X. Yes, I know Tupac and Malcolm X came out in the past, and so did Puff Daddy and ASAP Rocky, but there are lots of famous people, and it would take me a whole day to list off all the people that have come out of Harlem, but there's a lot. So please do keep that in mind. It's a very famous area of New York, especially for African Americans. So, anyway, another location within the story that is mentioned a lot is the Manhattan Detention Center. So, the Manhattan Detention Center is actually a real place. The protagonist Steve Harmon spends a lot of time at the Manhattan Detention Center. There's a difference between a jail and a prison, and the detention center is a jail. So people that are on trial are in jail, and the people that are in jail are people that cannot make bail. So bail is set by a judge, which we'll talk about later, and if people can't make the money to get out, they're stuck in jail throughout the entire process. So the Manhattan Detention Center is this giant building, and that is where a lot of our story takes place too. So another place that is mentioned a lot is this place called Rikers Island. Rikers Island is an island prison. So in seeing this picture, it is literally an island, and there's a couple of bridges, and there, and if I remember correctly, it's actually a drawbridge, so they can move the bridge up and down. It is actually located on the East River and is located between the boroughs, the Queens and the Bronx. So this prison is a male prison, so it's meant for men. I'm not sure if you know this, but jails typically are segregated by gender. So there's like all female prisons and there's all male prisons, typically, not all the time. But um, people that are found guilty of a crime are sent over to Staten Island. Sorry, not Staten Island, Rikers Island, and they have to spend a certain amount of time there for their sentence. Rikers Island is one of the largest prisons in America. It is also one of the most violent prisons in the country as well. Rikers Island is notorious for having guards not care about prisoners at all. I mean, like when fights break out, the guards just let them fight, or sometimes prisoners have been known not to get food. The last couple of years, like local governments in the state of New York, as well as the city government of New York City, have been trying to shut it down or at least make reforms to it, and that has not happened so far. So it's a scary place to be, and it is a real place. Okay, so now we're going to talk about courtroom basics. Actually, I'm going to take a little swig of my water. Just give me 1 sec. Okay, good. So courtroom basics. So a lot of our story takes place in a courtroom. So why is learning about a courtroom important? So most of the story is inside a courtroom, like I said. If you do not understand the basics, you're not going to understand the story at all. So, and as an adult, some of you will actually be on a jury. You'll need to know what to expect so you have an easy time when you're on when you are on a trial. So when like you're going to be summoned, and it's just easier to know the expectations and what everything is, so you're not just kind of like confused. So, parts of a courtroom. Here is a picture of a very basic diagram. So, if we were to walk in, we'd come back by the public door. And if we were sitting and watching a person on trial and we weren't involved in it, we would sit here. And there's a giant rail, it's usually made of wood, and there's a door. And then at the front, there is the judge's bench, and the clerk and court reporters are here. The judge has his own room right here outside this door. The jury comes in through here. And then the plaintiffs and the defendants sit here, which we will talk about in depth. So it seems like it's overwhelming, but it really is not. All right. So anyway, the judge's bench is at the front of the courtroom where the judge sits. The judge gets to sit at the front so he or she can hear and see everything going on. Everybody in the courtroom faces the judge. In a courtroom, the judge is the most important and powerful person in the courtroom. A judge can throw actually anybody in jail for not following his or her rules set at the time. That's just how it goes. So when you're in a courtroom, you need to be very respectful of the judge because they are the boss. Beneath the judge's bench is the area where the court clerks and the court reporters work. They sit there so that if the judge needs something, they can help him or her out right away. So like the judge usually sits here, and then right underneath it are the court or the judge's workers. So here's some pictures. So like the judge would sit here, and then here is where someone would be working, and right here would be the witness stand. That's where the person who is being asked questions by the lawyers are talking, and so on and so forth. So and usually underneath it is like a person who is taking notes. And I talked about this in our notes, which is a stenographer. And this is what a modern stenographer computer looks like. It looks like that because of the fact that like it takes a while to take notes, and they don't have enough time to write like a normal keyboard, so they have to learn how to use that. So it's much quicker. So anyway, the defendant and plaintiff have their own tables. So like a defendant will sit with his lawyer here, and the plaintiff could sit here. And if there's more than one plaintiff, there may be multiple people sitting here. So they sit there. Um, Usually, the person on trial is chained, to their desk, and so they can't run away or escape. And it is normal during this time that most people are being quiet except for the people that are talking up front, but it is normal for the people sitting here to be like having conversations with each other quietly, like at a whisper, writing notes to each other, because it's a serious deal, and sometimes the lawyers have to make like snap decisions about what to say or what not to say. So that's completely normal. A jury box is on the side typically of the courtroom. It's usually where the jury sits and listens to the trial. Usually the jury sits all very close together like that. I don't know how it is now with the coronavirus. I'm not sure. So juries are made up of random people from the community. Jury members determine if a person is guilty or not. There's always a person on the jury called the foreman/foreperson that represents the jury as a whole and speaks for the jury. Juries work differently in different states. So like in some states, they just have a clear vote and like they vote across and like whoever has the majority wins. And that's like, for example, if someone commits a crime and they rob a bank, and there is 13 jurors, and 12 out of the 13 say the person's guilty, and one person says he's not guilty. They go to the judge, they say we voted, and the majority rules. In other states, everybody has to agree. So if there's like 12 people that think that a person committed a crime and one person doesn't, they have to convince that other person that that person is guilty, and it might take a little bit of time. Also, in some states, juries figure out what the punishment for someone who is guilty is, and sometimes it's not. It just depends. There's 50 different states, so there's 50 different ways that juries work. So it just depends on what state you're in. Anyway, courtroom basics. I'm not going to play this because this is a video going through things, but this is like how you should dress and how you should act. You should watch this if you're watching this. I'm not going to do that. Skipping you by. So, and the last but not least is opening and closing statements. Opening statements happen at the beginning of a trial when the lawyer for the defendant and the lawyer representing the plaintiff make a long speech directly to the jury and nobody else. Like they're not talking to the people that are, writing for the newspapers. They're not talking to the judge. They're not talking to the police officers working. They're talking directly to the jury. The lawyers during the opening statement tell the jury why their side is right, is wrong, or right. Or I should say, tell the jury why their side is right and the other side is wrong. Let me just fix that really quickly. Then they will go through all the arguments. It's kind of like our like an essay. They kind of tell you like, this is what I'm going to be talking about. This is why I'm right. This is why the other person's wrong. The opening statements are the most important part of the trial because it sets the tone. There are a lot of emotions in the opening statements. If people are going to remember good opening statements if you're on a jury. If they're kind of poor, it's kind of dull for the jury and they don't care. Closing statements happens at the very end, and it's when the lawyers on both sides speak directly to the jury again and make a final plea for the jury to side with them. During this time, lawyers restate what they have stated throughout the trial so the jury remembers. During the closing statements, a lawyer cannot be like, say something that has not been brought up in court before. It's not legal. You can't do that because it could change the jury's mind at the last second. And the trial is not about new facts, it's about old facts being rehashed over. Closing statements can also have a lot of emotion. And that is pretty much it for all these notes. So I hope you have a wonderful day and I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you. Bye bye.